On a cool September evening, towards the end of a pretty miserable summer, we left on our first film tour, one which we intended as a forerunner for many to other lands. We arrived on the west border around mid-morning at which might be termed the in-laws' battleground, for here many 16-year-olds from England have been able to marry without their parents' consent. Here both gladdened and broken hearts have paced before leaving for home and new lives to the south. We motored north through Kirkcudbright en route to Ayr for an overnight stay, and were able to savour our first impression of Scotland. The unpolluted water of the Dee running westward from Aberdeenshire through the Balmoral country is still able to support trout here before it meets the sea at Solway Firth. I suppose, with apologies to New Zealanders, there's no finer lamb than that from the home of the brave, and we did sample it at lunch that day. Refreshed next morning on a true Scottish breakfast, we started our exploration of the Ayrshire countryside. The sun shone at last, a tantalising reminder of last year's summer of the century. On the River Aire we chatted with local fishermen who delighted in catching the cunning trout and bragged over the occasional hooked salmon. Our most lasting memory of Ayrshire will surely be our visit to the birthplace of Robbie Burns, one of Scotland's most loved sons. They have preserved his childhood home. They've installed a museum of some of his works and belongings, built a monument to his memory, and landscaped gardens in true keeping with his beautiful words. In the late morning we motored north through Glasgow into Stirlingshire to see the glorious Clampsy Fells, and eventually fell victim to the temptation to climb. We made some progress at first, but had not reckoned on the saturated nature of the hills. It had been a very wet summer. Eventually we got bogged down and settled for a climb of a few hundred feet. The views were, however, rewarding enough. We got our first glimpse of the renowned Loch Lomond as the sun was setting when we finally called it a day. We rested that night in a guest house near the loch and reckoned we'd fallen in love with this bonny land. In the morning we continued our journey north, taking in the countryside around Loch Lomond. This is the songwriter's countryside, and they have been truly inspired by its beauty. It was after Loch Lomond that we decided to get off the beaten track and motored through Glen Douglas onto the lanes to Loch Coilhead and finally to visit the Falls of Falloch. I suppose there are few geographic features that will attract man like water, and when it's rushing in cascades or falls, its attraction is even greater. I couldn't resist a paddle in what I was to discover were really icy waters flowing from the highlands of East Perthshire. Still pressing north and admiring the 3,500 feet of Ben Dorain, we entered the Macdonald country south of the notorious Glencoe. Then we met Jacque Macdonald himself, or so he said. He very obligingly played his bagpipe for us. The coincidence of finding a fully clad Macdonald armed with a pipe so far away from habitation yet on a public highway seemed too hard to believe. He was worth a drink, for he was in true character with the Scottish scene. Having picked up hitchhikers, we seemingly lost our freedom and just passed through Glencoe, scene of the infamous massacre, to eventually go north of Fort William onto the old training grounds of our wartime commandos. This monument, and Scotland's full of monuments, has been erected to commemorate those commandos who died and, no doubt, to those who survived the 1939-45 conflict. It was indeed enough to survive the training itself in this very rugged countryside of Inverness. And now we got our first look at the famous Loch Ness, the loch where its claimed monsters live. It is also the loch where a very famous man died attempting to break the water speed record. A monument stands today near the spot where this brave pioneer, John Cobb, lost his life. Still travelling north, the country got more and more barren, yet no less beautiful. We were now on ground that the average tourist avoids, this being the last leg through Sutherland to our goal at John O'Groats. This is the most northerly church on the mainland, and strangely enough, on the first gravestone we read was a memorial to a soul who came from Penzance. The lighthouse keeper at Dunnet Head, overlooking the Pentland Firth, invited us to tour his lighthouse. He no doubt welcomed a little company. The lighthouse is not on the milkman's round, nor anywhere near it, so a constant supply of milk is kept in an adjacent field to the building. It was a truly lovely day in the 70s, and the bay at Dunnet Head, completely deserted, looked so inviting, so we spent an hour there all alone, a beach all to ourselves. On the road south now into civilization, and a lay-by treat we didn't expect. On the east coast of Scotland are many fishing settlements with a charm of their own. We visited a couple, but will most remember the port of Macduff, where it seemed on Saturdays the whole fleet was at home. Macduff had more than fish and boats to offer, for here we found for our sole use on a hot day this super swim pool. I think our September holiday at the end of a dreadful summer had really paid off. Just a little rest before motoring to Fraserburgh to visit friends from home. We first saw the children in the street, but it wasn't long before their mum had them dressed for a Scottish garden performance. We travelled from Fraserburgh through Aberdeen on to Deeside to visit the Royal Church at Crathy near Balmoral. A section of the Cameroons provided the bodyguard for the royal family's visit. We managed to get just a glimpse of Prince Charles in the first car, and even less of the Queen and Prince Philip in the second. Our Sunday morning drive then took us en route to Edinburgh through the picturesque Dundee countryside onto the highest road in the British Isles, where Aberdeenshire and Perthshire meet, where skiing is the natural sport in winter. In the late afternoon we at last sighted the famous Forth Bridge, where it is said workmen never actually finished the job of painting it. That's for trains, and the piers of the road bridge are at last under construction. But for us it's a boat trip across the Forth by Queen's Ferry. Her voyages will one day go into the books of history, as the road bridge will eventually take over. We arrived in Edinburgh just in time for the last night of the festival, the September week that attracts tourists from all over the world. After a night lodge, we spent the next day exploring the city and naturally made a start at the castle which dominates the coal-blackened capital. After our visit to the castle, we walked the famous Royal Mile down to Hollingsworth House. This street, one of the most interesting in Europe, houses a host of specialist businessmen. Bagpipe makers, tartan weavers, collectors' cabins and antique dealers. They're all here and they all do good business. Margot posed outside the site of the White Horse Inn, whose story is told on the whisky bottles of that brand. At the end of the Royal Mile stands the majestic palace of Hollingsworth House, the historic home of Scottish royalty. It was loved by our Queen's grandparents, and she herself stays here during her Edinburgh visits. With little time left, we made a short but pleasant visit to Edinburgh's horticultural centre. Then the sun sank on our last evening in Scotland. Nearly broke, we spent that night in the car and refreshed early next morning for our journey south. The road south, which included breakfast in Newcastle, an hour on Ilkley Moor, and ended with a super 70 miles of the new M1 motorway to London. We spent the night at Greenford with our Uncle Wole, and next morning, after taking him to work, made our way across London to meet other members of our family and collect our son Lester, who had himself spent a holiday with his auntie and uncle.